The year is 1951. The location is the jagged frozen airspace above the Yalu River, the scar that separates North Korea from China. We call this the Alley, MiG Alley. To understand the horror that is about to unfold, you must understand the arrogance. For the pilots of the Soviet 64th Fighter Aviation Corps, specifically the elite veterans of World War II who have been secretly deployed to this theater, the sky is supposed to be their exclusive domain. They are flying the MiG-15 fighter, a machine that didn't just surprise the Western world, it shocked it into silence. It is a silver arrow, swept-winged and predatory. On paper and in the visceral reality of vertical combat, it is superior to anything the Americans can put in the air. It climbs faster, it flies higher. It carries heavy 37mm cannons capable of tearing a B-29 bomber apart with a single, thunderous hit. Against them are the Americans in their F-86 Sabre fighters. The Sabre is a beautiful machine, yes. It has elegant lines. But historically, in this specific moment, it is underpowered compared to the Soviet jet. It cannot climb with the MiG-15. It cannot reach the same service ceiling. The laws of physics and aerodynamics dictate the rules of engagement here. It is a mathematical certainty. If a Soviet pilot finds himself in trouble, all he has to do is pull back on the stick and climb. He can ascend into the thin air where the American jets stall and gasp, leaving the Sabre fighters helplessly watching from below. It is a sanctuary in the sky, a tactical advantage that should guarantee dominance. They are the eagles looking down at the sparrows. But on a Tuesday afternoon in late spring, the impossible happens, and it begins with a feeling of profound confusion that will ripple all the way back to the Kremlin. Captain Nikolai Sutyagin, a man who will go on to become the top ace of the conflict, is leading a flight of 4 MiG-15 aircraft on a patrol sweep. The weather is clear. Visibility is unlimited. Below them, the rugged terrain of Korea looks like crumpled brown paper. Sutyagin spots a formation of American Sabres far below, perhaps 5,000 feet down. This is the perfect setup. The Soviet doctrine is clear. Dive, strike with heavy cannons, and use the superior climb rate to zoom back up to safety before the Americans can retaliate. It is a boom and zoom tactic that relies on energy retention. Sutyagin signals the attack. The 4 silver jets roll over and dive. The speed builds rapidly, 600 miles per hour, then 650. The airframe shudders, compressing against the sound barrier. They scream down upon the American formation. The Sabres break hard, scattering like a flock of startled birds. Sutyagin picks his target, lines up the crude optical sight, and fires. The heavy cannons thump, sending tracers arcing through the sky. He misses. The deflection angle is too steep, the closing speed too high. It does not matter. He has the energy. He pulls back hard on the stick, the G-forces crushing him into his seat. The MiG-15 responds, its Klimov engine roaring as it converts that speed back into altitude. He shoots upward, expecting to see the American Sabre falling away below him, unable to follow. But when he looks back, the Sabre is not falling away. It is following. This makes no sense to the Soviet veteran. The Sabre is heavier, it has less thrust. It should be bleeding energy, stalling out. Yet, the American pilot is hanging on. But the real shock comes a split second later. Sutyagin is now thousands of feet away, twisting in a high G climb, presenting a small, difficult target. At this range, hitting a maneuvering jet with machine guns is statistically impossible. The human eye cannot judge the lead distance accurately. The vibration of the aircraft, the wind drift, the bullet drop, the variables are too complex for a human brain to calculate in a fraction of a second. And yet, tracers flash past his canopy. They are not wild spray and pray shots. They are terrifyingly accurate. A stream of .50 caliber rounds slams into the wing of his wingman's jet. Smoke erupts. The hit was precise, surgical, achieved from a distance and an angle that defies the known limitations of aerial gunnery. Sutyagan watches in horror as his wingman spirals down. He is not angry yet. He is bewildered. He knows the capabilities of the Browning machine guns the Americans use. He knows the effective range. That shot should not have happened. It was a ghost bullet. A lucky shot, perhaps. A 1 in a million alignment of chance. He aborts the mission, diving back toward the sanctuary of the Chinese border airfields. His heart is pounding. Not from the exertion of the fight, but from the uncanny feeling that the rules of the game have changed without anyone telling him. Back on the ground at the Antung airfield, the mood is chaotic. Other pilots are landing, their faces pale, their hands shaking as they light cigarettes. It was not just Sutyagan. Across the sector, Soviet pilots are reporting the same inexplicable phenomenon. They are engaging the Americans. They are using their superior vertical performance to escape, and they are getting hit. Ground crews swarm the damaged MiG-15 aircraft that managed to limp home. They examine the bullet holes. They are grouped tightly. This is the hallmark of a sniper, not a dogfighter spraying lead in a desperate turn. To achieve a grouping like that on a target moving at 600 miles per hour, while pulling 4 Gs, requires a level of marksmanship that does not exist. No amount of training at the Soviet flight academies prepared them for this. Debriefing officers demand answers. Did you slow down? They ask. Did you fly straight and level? No, the pilots insist. We were maneuvering, we were climbing, we were outside their effective range. The political officers, the commissars attached to the unit to ensure loyalty, are suspicious. They suspect cowardice or incompetence. They cannot accept that the American equipment is performing impossible feats. They accuse the pilots of letting the Americans get too close. But the veterans know what they saw. They saw tracers curving into them from distances where the American plane was just a speck. It is as if the American bullets are guided by an invisible hand. The sun sets over the Yalu, but the lights in the command bunkers burn late into the night. The stakes could not be higher. You must understand the position of the Soviet Union at this moment in history. It is 1951. The world is balancing on the razor's edge of nuclear annihilation. Stalin is still alive, and his paranoia is at its peak. The war in Korea is a proxy war, a testing ground. If the Americans can dominate the air over Korea, it means their bombers can penetrate Soviet airspace. It means that the vast, expensive air defense network the Soviet Union is building, relying heavily on the MiG-15, might be fundamentally flawed. The MiG-15 was their ace in the hole. It was the surprise that was supposed to level the playing field against Western numbers. If the Americans have found a way to swat them out of the sky with ease, despite the MiG's aerodynamic superiority, then the balance of power has shifted catastrophically. A terrifying theory begins to take root in the mess halls of Antung. The pilots whisper it to each other. They say the Americans have developed a new weapon. Maybe it is a proximity fuse for their machine gun bullets. Maybe it is a new type of super-velocity ammunition that travels so fast it requires almost no lead calculation. Or perhaps, and this is the most chilling thought, they have developed a way to control their aircraft that the Soviets simply do not understand. The zone. That is what they start to call it. It is an invisible sphere around the American jets. If you enter it, you die. It doesn't matter if you are faster. It doesn't matter if you can climb higher. If you are in the zone, the Americans don't miss. General Georgy Lobov, commander of the 64th Fighter Aviation Corps, is under immense pressure. Moscow wants results. They want dead Americans and safe Soviet pilots. Instead, Lobov is writing letters of condolence and watching his best men vanish into the hillsides of Korea. He orders a change in tactics. Get closer, he demands. Do not fire until you can see the rivets. He thinks the problem is Soviet marksmanship. He thinks his pilots are firing from too far away while the Americans are showing better discipline. He is wrong. The order from Moscow was simple. Bring us the Sabre. But in the freezing hellscape of the Korean winter, nothing was simple. The hunt for the F-86 became a war within a war, fought not by pilots, but by desperate men in the mud. You have to understand the geography of the crash sites. The air battles took place over the coast, the tidal flats where the Yalu empties into the Yellow Sea. When a jet went down here, it didn't just crash, it vanished. The tides in this region are violent, rushing in to cover the wreckage in feet of silt and freezing water, then rushing out to leave it exposed like a whale carcass. The Americans knew this geography too. They knew that a downed Sabre was a treasure chest of secrets. Their standing orders were scorched earth. If a pilot ejected, the next flight of American planes wasn't sent to rescue him. They were sent to destroy what he left behind. Navy Corsairs and Sky Raiders would swarm the crash site, dropping napalm and high explosives, turning their own cutting-edge technology into molten slag to keep it from the Soviets. So, the Soviet recovery teams had to work in the blind spots. They had to work at night, under the cover of storms, racing against the sunrise and the American spotter planes. In October 1951, the opportunity finally arrived. An F-86A, tail number 49-1319, was hit. The pilot, Lieutenant Bill N. Garrett, managed to belly land the crippled jet on a sandbar just south of the river mouth. He ejected safely and was plucked from the water by a rescue helicopter. But the plane was intact. The Soviet 64th Corps signaled the retrieval team. This wasn't just a truck and a crane. This was a battalion-sized operation. A team of Soviet technical officers, disguised in Chinese uniforms to maintain plausible deniability, moved out with hundreds of Chinese infantrymen. They reached the sandbar at low tide. The jet was there, glinting in the moonlight, sitting in the mud like a fallen spaceship. But they had a problem. The tide was turning. They had 4 hours before the ocean swallowed the prize. And they were miles from the nearest road. They didn't use cranes. They didn't use heavy machinery that would bog down in the silt. They used human muscle. Ropes were lashed around the wing roots of the Sabre. Hundreds of men, boots sucking in the freezing mud, heaved in unison. They dragged the 5-ton aircraft inch by inch across the tidal flats. As dawn broke, they hadn't reached the tree line. The sound of American engines buzzed overhead. The team scrambled to cover the silver jet with reeds, straw, and mud, camouflaging it against the gray landscape. They lay face down in the freezing water as American reconnaissance planes circled, looking for the telltale shape of swept wings. For 2 days they played this game, dragging at night, hiding by day. They dismantled the wings with hand tools. They loaded the fuselage onto a rickety flatbed truck that groaned under the weight. The convoy moved only in darkness, without headlights, navigating the cratered dirt roads of North Korea, dodging night fighter attacks. When they finally crossed the Yalu River into the sanctuary of China, there was no celebration, just relief. They loaded the carcass onto a specialized train car, sealed it, and marked it as agricultural equipment. It began the long, slow journey across the Trans-Siberian Railway to Moscow. They had delivered the body of the beast. Now, the scientists had to find its soul. The dissection begins. Soviet engineers swarmed the aircraft like surgeons. They stripped the skin panels. They remove the engine. But the ballistics experts go straight for the nose. They want to see the guns. They want to see the magic weapon that is swatting their MiG-15 aircraft out of the sky. What they find is disappointing. They pull out 6 Browning M3 machine guns. They disassemble them on the sterile white tables of the laboratory. They measure the barrel rifling. They test the spring tension. They analyze the metallurgy of the firing pins. The report that lands on Stalin's desk is baffling. These are not superweapons. They are essentially the same .50 caliber machine guns the Americans used in World War II, slightly sped up to fire 1,200 rounds per minute. They are crude. They rely on kinetic energy. They are not explosive shells like the 37mm monsters on the MiG-15. The Soviet engineers are confused. This is it? They ask. This is what is killing us? If the gun is primitive and the bullet is dumb, then the magic must be in the aiming. Attention shifts to the cockpit. The canopy is shattered and the instrument panel is damaged from the impact and the saltwater corrosion. But sitting atop the dashboard, mounted prominently behind the armored glass, is a black box, a sight. The technicians pry it loose. It is labeled A1CM. To the untrained eye, it looks like a standard optical reflector sight, a piece of glass where a reticle is projected, similar to what the Germans used, similar to what the Soviets themselves use. But when they open the casing, they find a density of wiring and vacuum tubes that looks less like a gun sight and more like a miniature computer. It is packed with delicate gyroscopes, magnetic amplifiers, and a complex web of circuitry. However, the unit is smashed. The delicate internal gimbals, the spinning tops that keep the gyro stable, are crushed by the G-forces of the crash. The vacuum tubes are broken glass. The Soviets can see what it is, but they cannot make it work. They cannot power it up to see the ghost that their pilots are reporting. They try to reverse engineer the schematic. They realize this site is connected to a small intake on the nose of the jet, a radar. Radar ranging, the chief engineer mutters. They are using radar to get the distance. This is a significant finding, but it leads them to a dangerous and wrong conclusion. The Soviets assume that the radar simply tells the pilot how far away the target is, perhaps adjusting the size of the reticle. They have similar concepts on the drawing board. But a range-finding radar does not explain the lead, the ability to predict where the MiG will be in 2 seconds. While Soviet generals were screaming at their pilots to fly more aggressively, and while KGB agents were sifting through charred wreckage in the frozen mud of Korea, the answer to the mystery was sitting calmly on a laboratory workbench in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It was not a weapon forged in the fires of the Manhattan Project. It was not alien technology recovered from a crash site. It was a math problem solved by a genius who understood that the human brain had reached its evolutionary limit. The source of the ghost in MiG Alley was the instrumentation laboratory at MIT, led by a man named Dr. Charles Stark Draper. Doc Draper was not a fighter pilot. He was an engineer who looked at war as a series of equations. He understood something fundamental about the jet age before anyone else did. Speed kills accuracy. In World War II, aircraft flew at 300 miles per hour. At that speed, a human pilot with good instincts could estimate lead. He could look at a German fighter turning in front of him, guess how far ahead to shoot, and pull the trigger. It was an art form. It relied on Kentucky windage and gut feeling. But Draper looked at the numbers for the coming jet age. 600 miles per hour. Closing speeds of 1,000 miles per hour. At those velocities, the geometry of an intercept changes faster than the human eye can transmit data to the brain, and faster than the brain can transmit a command to the hand. By the time a pilot sees the enemy and decides to shoot, the enemy is already gone. Draper realized that asking a pilot to calculate ballistics at Mach 0.9 was not just difficult, it was mathematically impossible. The pilot didn't need a better gun. He needed a partner. He needed a machine that could predict the future. The project was codenamed the A1 series, eventually evolving into the A4 gun sight. But to the engineers, it was simply the sight. The heart of the device was not a microchip. Those didn't exist yet. It was a gyroscope. But not just any gyroscope. Draper had perfected a technology called the floated integrating gyro. Imagine a small, precision machine spinning top suspended inside a can filled with a thick, molasses-like fluid. This fluid dampened the vibrations and shocks of a fighter jet. It allowed the gyro to sense the tiniest movements of the aircraft with absolute purity. Here is how the American magic actually worked. The secret the Soviets were desperate to find. In a traditional sight, the crosshair is fixed to the glass. Where the nose points, the crosshair points. In Draper's sight, the crosshair, the pipper, was not fixed. It was disturbed. It floated. When an American pilot banked his F-86 Sabre to follow a turning MiG-15, the gyroscopes inside the sight would feel the G-force and the rate of the turn. They would physically move the reflection of the reticle on the glass. The sight would drift the reticle away from the enemy plane. This sounds counterintuitive. Why would the sight move away? It was a psychological trick. To get the reticle back onto the target, the pilot would instinctively pull the stick harder, turning the plane tighter. By chasing the dot, the pilot was unknowingly forcing his aircraft into the perfect lead angle. The sight was doing the calculus. It was measuring the turn rate, the air density, and the ballistics. It was saying, if you want to hit that MiG, you need to be aiming here, at this empty patch of sky. The pilot didn't have to guess. He just had to obey the dot. But there was one missing variable, range. To solve the ballistic equation perfectly, the computer needed to know exactly how far away the target was, down to the foot. Enter the AN/APG-30. This was the radar the Soviets had found, but they were wrong about what it did. It didn't fly the plane, it didn't see through clouds. It was a small, simple range-finding radar located in the nose lip of the Sabre. When the American pilot closed in on a MiG-15, the radar automatically locked on. It fed the precise distance, say 1,200 feet, directly into the gyroscopic computer. The result was a closed-loop system of devastating lethality. The gyros measured the turn. The radar measured the distance. The computer calculated the spot. All the American pilot had to do was fly the airplane so that the glowing orange diamond was resting on the silver fuselage of the MiG. He didn't have to lead. He didn't have to guess. He just put the thing on the thing and pulled the trigger. It turned average pilots into snipers. It turned good pilots into aces. While the Soviet pilot was wrestling with a vibrating optical sight, frantically doing mental trigonometry, trying to guess how many plane lengths ahead to shoot, while his blood drained from his head under 5 Gs, the American pilot was playing a video game. We know that the cloning effort failed. We know the pilots rejected the copy. But we rarely talk about the men who were ordered to do the impossible. When the crates arrived at NII-17 and Plant 118 in Moscow, the engineers were initially euphoric. They held the American device in their hands. It seemed so small, so manageable. But as the months wore on, the atmosphere in the design bureau shifted from excitement to terror. The head of the project, a man named Colonel S.P. Kalmykov, realized too late that he was trapped. He had promised Stalin a perfect copy. He had assumed that since he had the blueprints and the physical object, production would be a formality. He was wrong. The failure wasn't in the design, it was in the chemistry. The American floated gyro relied on a specific type of fluorocarbon fluid, a heavy, inert liquid that had to remain perfectly viscous at -60 degrees Celsius and +80 degrees Celsius. The Soviet chemical industry didn't produce anything like it. They tried to synthesize a substitute. They mixed oils. They experimented with kerosene blends, but every batch failed. If the fluid was too thick, the gyro was sluggish. The reticle dragged across the glass like a lazy eye. If the fluid was too thin, the gyro vibrated, shaking the reticle into a blur. Then there were the ball bearings. The American bearings in the A4 sight were masterpieces of metallurgy, polished to a smoothness that Soviet tools couldn't measure, let alone replicate. When the Soviet factories tried to mass-produce them, they came out microscopically rough. To a tank, that roughness meant nothing. To a precision gyroscope, it was catastrophic friction. The engineers began to disappear. In the Stalinist system, failure was not seen as a technical hurdle. It was seen as sabotage. If the sight didn't work, it was because someone didn't want it to work. The NKVD shadow over the laboratory grew longer. Late-night meetings were held where grown men, brilliant physicists, wept in frustration, holding the American parts up to the light, asking why they couldn't make their own metal behave the same way. They were forced to cannibalize. In a desperate move to make the prototypes work for the inspection by the generals, they actually took the few surviving American ball bearings and fluid from the captured wreckage and installed them into the Soviet casings. It was a Potemkin village, a Soviet shell with an American heart. It passed the initial inspection. The generals were pleased. Medals were awarded. But when the factory spun up to produce thousands of them using Soviet parts, the deception collapsed. The mass-produced units failed immediately. The tragedy of the Soviet engineer in the 1950s was the tragedy of Tantalus. They could see the technology. They could understand the math. They were smart enough to know exactly how the Americans were beating them, but they were handcuffed by an industrial base that was built for hammers, not scalpels. They realized then that the gap wasn't just about secrets. You can steal a secret. You can't steal a culture of precision. That realization, that they were decades behind, not in theory, but in the basic ability to make things straight and smooth, was a psychological blow that the Soviet electronics industry never truly recovered from. They spent the next 30 years building bigger and bigger rockets to compensate for the fact that they couldn't build smaller and smaller guidance chips. July 1953. The Korean War ends in an uneasy armistice. The roar of jet engines over the Yalu River fades into silence. The pilots go home. But in the classified archives of the Kremlin and the Pentagon, the war over the data is just beginning. The final scorecard of the air war is a subject of intense debate to this day. American propaganda claimed a kill ratio of 10-1. Modern historians suggest the number is lower, perhaps 4-1 against Soviet pilots. But the raw numbers mask the true verdict. The real victory wasn't in the body count. It was in the psychological trauma inflicted on the Soviet military-industrial complex. The mystery of the A4 site planted a seed of doubt that would grow like a cancer for the next 40 years. It proved that in the modern age, superior aerodynamics, the curve of a wing, the thrust of an engine, were no longer enough. The MiG-15 was, by all accounts, a better flying machine than the F-86 Sabre. It could fly higher, it accelerated faster. It should have won, but it lost. It lost because the Americans brought a computer to a knife fight. The failure of the Soviet copy, the ASP-4N, had a devastating ripple effect. It forced the Soviet Union into a reactionary posture that they never truly escaped. Instead of innovating their own path in microelectronics and precision computing, they became obsessed with theft and imitation. The F-86 Sabre and its secret site marked the death of the Knight of the Air. Before this moment, the fighter pilot was a warrior poet, a man of instinct and reflex. He looked with his eyes and killed with his hands. After this moment, the pilot began his slow transformation into a systems manager. The A4 site was the great-grandfather of the modern heads-up display. It was the ancestor of the aim assist algorithms in the F-35 Lightning. It was the first step toward a world where the plane flies itself, and the pilot is merely the vote in the loop deciding when to authorize the kill. Today, if you walk into the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, you can stand next to an F-86 Sabre. You can look into the cockpit. It looks cramped, analog, almost antique. The famous A4 site looks like a simple piece of junk metal and glass. But if you look closely, you are looking at the pivot point of history. That small black box didn't just shoot down MiG-15 aircraft. It shot down the Soviet doctrine of brute force. It proved that the most powerful weapon in war is no longer the biggest gun. It is the smartest chip. The pilots of the Soviet 64th Fighter Aviation Corps went to their graves remembering the zone. They remembered the impossible shots, the tracers that seemed to curve like magic, and the terrifying realization that the Americans weren't just fighting them, they were calculating them. The mystery was solved, but the lesson was fatal. The Soviet Union spent the next 4 decades chasing the ghost of American technology, running a race they had already lost in the skies over Korea in 1951.